Welcome to Alasquatch, the show all about Bigfoot in the great state of Alaska. I'm your host, Beans Baxter. So lace up your boots, zip up your coat, and come with me on an adventure as we explore all things cryptid in the last frontier. Hey guys, welcome to this special, well, every episode's a special. Welcome to this episode of Alasquatch. We're going to do something a little different. Typically on this show, all roads lead to Alaska. This one, not so much. There was some stuff in the news and in the media recently that I kind of wanted to, it caught my interest, and I wanted to talk about it. And being a retired law enforcement officer, it really, it's really something that I feel passionately about and I want to talk about. So I thought that we would do it. And then at the end here, when this is over, I've got a question to ask you guys, like something I would like your input on. So hang around and let's get into it. Like I said, I'm a retired police officer. I was a police officer for 15 years. And when I left, I was the investigation sergeant over my department, which meant I either conducted or supervised all felony level investigations. So any theft over like $500 or any serious crime, murder, sexual assault, stuff like that. So I have some training, a little bit of training, and this stuff started hitting the news recently, and I was like, man, I got to talk about that. So we're going to talk about the recent uh, peppering of articles about Jack the Ripper being identified. So we're going to get into that. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of Jack the Ripper, the suspects, the evidence, and finally my thoughts and theories on it. So let's get started. So Jack the Ripper, for those of you that don't know, which I'm sure everybody listening to this has heard, Jack the Ripper was a serial killer. He operated in the London district of Whitechapel between the years of 1888 and 1891. There's a little bit of contention about that. We'll talk about that here in a second. Whitechapel, I guess, was kind of on the east end of London. And from what I gather, it was not a good place to live during that time. There was a huge influx of Irish, Jewish, and Eastern European immigrants that flooded into the area. And Whitechapel became really like overcrowded, dangerously so. There wasn't enough resources, jobs, or infrastructure to go around. Robbery and other crimes were commonplace. And a lot of the women in the Whitechapel area turned to prostitution to survive. And in 1888, London police estimated there were 62 brothels and around 1,200 women working as prostitutes in the Whitechapel area. And the Jack the Ripper, he targeted prostitutes. And so Whitechapel was what we would say in the military. It was a target-rich environment. He typically unalived his victims by cutting their throats and mutilating their abdominal areas and removing organs. And it's been speculated by people that study the case that Jack the Ripper was a doctor, had some kind of medical training, given the nature of the mutilations. However, there are those that dispute that theory as well. During the Ripper's reign of terror, the Whitechapel district, police investigated 11 murders, but only 5 are considered canonical. So, in other words, only 5 murders are confidently considered by investigators to have been perpetrated by Jack the Ripper, although there's some Ripperologists that question if all 5 victims of Jack the Ripper and speculate that maybe only 3 of the 5 were killed by the Ripper. We're going to get into that a little bit more. But the 5 victims are Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. And their murders were never solved, and panic and media circus surrounded the case. It led to the legend of Jack the Ripper kind of growing and becoming infamous worldwide, both famous and infamous. And for the purposes of today's episode, I want you to pay close attention to the name Catherine Eddowes. Is it's going to come back up here in a few minutes. But all five of the canonical murders occurred in 1888. And the murders before and after those either have like added or missing modus operandi that led investigators to lean toward them not being perpetrated by Jack the Ripper. Remember, I said earlier, he would cut their throats and mutilate their abdomens, and some of those 11 didn't quite, like they would just have some stab wounds or something like that. So basically anybody in this like time frame, that any woman in this time frame that was killed with a knife was suspected to be killed by Jack the Ripper. So along with the canonical five, there are victims from both before and after the time frames of the canonical five that some speculate may be attributed to Jack the Ripper. One case is even in the United States, in New York. There was some theories that maybe when the murder stopped in Whitechapel, it was because the Ripper had either died, been incarcerated, or had moved. So anytime a murder of similar means occurred somewhere in the world, there around that time, there was some speculation that maybe he was here, maybe he had moved or traveled, maybe in an attempt to escape, or maybe just through business or whatever. Even though by today's standards, a serial killer with a body count of 5 might seem a little low, the brutalness of the murders and the mystery surrounding the identity of Jack the Ripper has propelled it through the years. I mean, Jack the Ripper has become a main staple of pop culture. He's appeared in too many books and movies and TV shows to even start to list. He's gone toe to toe with fictional heroes like Sherlock Holmes and even Batman, if you're familiar with Gotham by Gaslight. So Jack the Ripper has maintained a presence in society throughout the years. There's even a name and for the study and interest of the subject called Ripperology. And the people that are well researched in the subject are known as Ripperologists. I mentioned them earlier. And there's even an industry surrounding Jack the Ripper. You can take historical tours of the Whitechapel area. They're available if you go travel over to London, England. You can book those and take a walking tour of the area. And yeah, I mean, everybody knows who Jack the Ripper is, or has heard of him, or seen some type of media or book or movie or something that has referenced him or has him as a character in it. So there were a few names tossed around in regards to the identity of Jack the Ripper. However, for the purpose of this episode, we're focusing on one, and hopefully I don't butcher the name. It's Aaron Kosminski. So in 1894, a memorandum written by Sir Melville McNaughton, that's a cool name. He's the assistant constable of the London Metropolitan Police. He named one of the suspects of Jack the Ripper as a Polish Jew named Kosminski with no first name. McNaughton's memo was discovered in his private papers in 1959. The Metropolitan Police released that to the public in the 70s, and McNaughton stated that there were strong reasons for suspecting Kosminski because he had a great hatred of women with strong homicidal tendencies. And to bolster that, another high-ranking member of the police also stated in his memoir that Jack the Ripper was a low-class Polish Jew, and it was reported that a colleague of the memoir's author had identified the suspect in his copy of the memoir by writing the name Kosminski in the margins. And it's believed that Kosminski was being watched by the police, and he was eventually taken into custody, placed in a workhouse, and then in an asylum. And we're going to get into that a little bit later. In 1987, there was a ripperologist, there's that word, Martin Fido, and he was searching asylum records for the name Kosminski, and he found one. He found one Kosminski in that time frame that had been admitted to an asylum, and that name was Aaron Kosminski. And Kosminski apparently suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, and in vague notes from the police commissioner, it was said Kosminski, I'm going to be slaughtering that name, indulged in solitary vices and self-abuse, whatever that means. I think that self-abuse may have been a euphemism for masturbation, but I don't know. read that somewhere when I was doing my research, so I'm not sure. Uh, Also, Kosminski was reported to live very close to the Whitechapel area. He didn't live directly in Whitechapel, but he did reside very close, like on the border of Whitechapel and another section of town, putting him in proximity to commit the murders. And there's a few references of Kosminski being a barber surgeon. And back then, barber shops are almost like a one-stop shop type of establishment. And their duties included, I mean, they cut hair, they pulled teeth, they do bloodletting, they'd set broken bones, they'd amputate limbs, they do minor surgery and like lance abscesses and perform emergency first aid, treat wounds. They and took care of sick people. And in some towns, like port towns, I know they'd also be like tattoo artists because sailors who are on shore leave, they go and they drink in corrals and get into fights. And before they go back to the ship, they would go to the barbers and they would get their black eyes and stuff. They'd put like ice and meat on them, trying to get the swelling to go down. And if they couldn't get the black eye to like settle down, they just like slap some makeup on it and send the sailors back to their ship. That way, the sailors' chain of command, they wouldn't know they'd been fighting. So, barbers were kind of a jack of all trades back then. They were just about good for whatever, a dentist or whatever you needed. They would take care of it. So it's not beyond the realm of reason to think that if Kosminski actually had been or was working as a barber at some time, he had had some experience or training in using sharp surgical type tools. Although there was some concerns I come across in my research that said Kosminski hadn't worked in a long time. He wasn't working apparently at the time of the murders, and he wasn't. He just wasn't functioning. He wasn't capable of functioning at a job. So it's doubtful that he was a practicing barber at the time of the murders. And Kosminski was committed to an asylum. And the reason given for his commitment was that he had threatened his sister with a knife. But the problem is another guy had committed him to the asylum. And I guess they're a little fuzzy on the his sister thing. They don't know if he threatened his own sister or the gentleman who committed him. If it was his sister that he threatened, if it was his own sister or somebody else's sister. So I mean, it was the 1800s. Excuse me. The records, like record keeping, like was not that sharp back then. Uh, so with the area he lived in and given his possible profession, we can probably safely say that he had the means and the opportunity to be the Jack the Ripper. The main question for Kaminsky is, did he have the motive? Did his mental illness drive him to commit these crimes? And now we have a little bit more information that kind of brings us into the modern time, to the modern days. And this is what has been going around in the news recently. And in 2007, there was a British author named Russell Edwards. He had this shawl in his collection. It's just a big, large piece of cloth. People would, women would like wear them around their necks or over their heads. And it was kind of like a big scarf, only it was, big and square or rectangular shape. And the shawl was alleged to have belonged to canonical Jack the Ripper victim Catherine Eddowes. Remember her? I mentioned her earlier. So Edwards, this guy that has the shawl, he began having it tested, and he believes he's connected the shawl to the 3 times great granddaughter of Eddowes, the victim. And further, he got some more DNA on the shawl, and after some searching, he found some DNA from one of Aaron Kosminski's descendants. I guess it was like his Kaminsky's sister's like great granddaughter or something like that, and says it's a match. So he says there's DNA that is traced back to the victim and DNA that's traced back to the suspect, Mr. Kosminski. And Edwards is quoted as saying, "I've spent 14 years working on it. We have definitely solved the mystery of who Jack the Ripper was. Only non-believers that want to perpetrate the myth will doubt this. This is it now. We have unmasked him." And that's Mr. Edwards. That's what he says. That's his final word on the subject. He believes he has unmasked Jack the Ripper. So now we have this Edwards guy running around telling all the news outlets that will listen that he solved the Jack the Ripper case. And unsurprisingly, the media is all over it. They're just story after story. And what I don't understand is that this has been going on since about 2014 with these DNA studies. And why is it only hitting the news now? Let's talk about this evidence here. And when I first heard about this study, the first thing that popped into my cop brain was, how in the world did a private citizen get evidence from a murder case? Typically, evidence with for murder cases, you don't get rid of it. It doesn't go anywhere. You hang on to it. Now, there may be, depending on, I don't know what England's laws are or London's laws are, depending on the state you live in, it might be a little different. But typically, you don't want to get rid of evidence with crimes that have no statute of limitations. So that's most of those are a murder or like some type of sexual assault. So typically during a homicide investigation, you want to collect any and all items that may have been peripherally involved, and that includes clothing. Even before DNA was a thing, an item like a shawl would be considered important evidence because it could belong to the victim or the suspect or an accomplice, and it would be important to collect it. It's not something that you would leave behind or just not bother with. And so my question is, how did a private citizen get this incredibly piece of evidence? And the answer is he bought it at an auction. So I'm just gonna go ahead and read you verbatim the portion of the Wikipedia article on this, because it's very important that we establish the chain of custody here. So this is from the Wikipedia article on Aaron Kosminski, and this is talking about the shawl that Mr. Edwards has in his possession and how he came to get it. Remember, I'm very, very concerned on how this gentleman got a piece of murder evidence in his collection. So the shawl is said to have been found at the site of the murder of Catherine Eddowes and to have been passed down in the family of Amos Simpson, who was a police officer at the time of the murder. According to the family tradition, first recorded in 1988, 100 years after the murder, Amos Simpson obtained the shawl after discovering Catherine Eddowes' body. This is certainly incorrect, as the body was discovered by police constable Edward Watkins. The murder took place in the city of London, which had its own police force separate from the Metropolitan Police, and the subsequent events were recorded at the inquest, including the names of the other police officers who attended the scene, and no officers from other police forces were mentioned. And Amos Simpson was a Metropolitan Police officer, and in 1888 he was stationed in Cheshunt in Hertfordshire, about 14 miles away from the scene. So remember when I mentioned chain of custody a while ago? It's really important in any investigation, and it's super imperative during a murder investigation. And chain of custody is simply the tracking of the people and the places that a piece of evidence goes to or with. A sample chain of custody might go like this. I'm gonna walk you through this. Let's say we're investigators at a crime scene. It doesn't matter what crime it is. We'll say it's some kind of violent assault or something. And we're in the kitchen and we look down and there's a knife on the floor next to the oven. So we would collect the knife, which we'll talk about the collection process here in a second, but let's focus on chain of custody here right now. So what would happen is let's say I'm the investigating officer. I'm going to first document where it's at. We'll talk about that in a minute too. But I'm going to collect the evidence, and that starts the chain of custody. So the knife was collected by Sergeant Beans, and I'm going to write in my evidence log, knife. I'm going to describe the knife with green handle, found on kitchen floor next to oven by Sergeant Beans. That's me. And then I'm going to take that knife and I'm going to take it to the police department and I'm going to log it into evidence. Typically, now it kind of depends on the police department. I know like Anchorage PD, a lot of times because the crime lab is in Anchorage, and a lot of times they'll just take stuff like straight to the crime lab and drop it off with them. We didn't have that luxury. We had an evidence room. We'd have to log it into evidence. So you go to the police department, you fill out the paperwork for the evidence, and you log it into evidence, and you put the time it was collected, the date it was location, or the date it was collected, the place it was collected, who it was collected by, any pertinent details like that. And you typically put it in a locker, a secure locker that only the evidence custodian has access to. And then the next day or whenever he gets around to it, the evidence custodian will take it out of the evidence locker, log it into the evidence room, say I, the evidence custodian, took this and I stored it in evidence room bin 14. So there's most evidence rooms are just have shelves and shelves of boxes and bins and stuff, and they put evidence items in them. So let's say a couple days go by. Okay, I need to submit this knife to the crime lab. We need to test it for DNA or fingerprints. So I get the paperwork and I say, I'm Sergeant Beans. I collected this knife. I need it sent to the crime lab for fingerprint and or DNA analysis. So I take that paperwork, I give it to the evidence custodian, or I put it in his little inbox or whatever. Evidence custodian checks his box. He's like, oh, okay, I got to send that knife to the evidence or to this crime lab. So he goes into the evidence room. He pulls the knife out of bin 14. He writes on the evidence log, I, the evidence custodian, pulled the knife out of bin 14 and I took it or sent it to the crime lab. Then he sends it off to the crime lab. Now, once it gets to the crime lab does their own chain of evidence on it. They'll say, we received it from, the evidence custodian at Beans's PD on this date and time, and we stored it here until we were ready to test it. And then this technician got it out and did these tests in this order, blah, blah, blah. And then there's the reports where they found DNA or they didn't. They found fingerprints or they didn't. And then typically when they're done with the testing, they'll send the knife back to the police department. And like for us, a lot of our stuff went certified mail because the crime lab was so far away. Some people drive their stuff up or whatever, and they have the luxury of having a crime lab in their city and they can just drop it off. But we would get the evidence back, and then we'd have to log it back into evidence. We'd say, oh, this knife is back from the crime lab. So it went from the crime lab back to Beans's police department. Evidence custodian has the knife again. I'm going to log it back into the evidence room. It's going to go back in bin 14 from whence it came, and it's going to sit there. And the crime lab is going to send Sergeant Beans, the case officer, they're going to send him the lab reports. They're going to say yes or no, we did find or we didn't find fingerprints. And it's just going to sit there. And then let's say 2 years later, that's probably pretty accurate actually. About 2 years later, the case is going to go to trial. Let's say we had arrested somebody and they, for whatever reason, they didn't plead guilty. They didn't take a deal. They wanted to go to trial. So the prosecutor, the district attorney, is going to call me or Sergeant Beans and say, hey, remember that case with the knife? It's going to trial. The trial is going to start on this day. We're going to need that knife in the courtroom for evidence. So I go realistically, I go, was that my case? I don't remember that. And I have to go back and look and see, oh yes, indeed, that was my case. Happened a lot more than you would think. Go to the evidence custodian, fill out a form, be like, hey, I need the knife on this date to go to court. So the custodian with the knife out hands it over to me. And in the evidence log, it says Sergeant Beans takes the knife to court. And then at the end of the day, I take the knife back to the police department, put it back in the bin or back in the evidence locker. And, depending on, like, maybe I might need to go and pull it back out of there tomorrow to take it back to court, or maybe if it's just a 1 day or, real quick trial, they don't need it anymore. It goes back in the evidence bin. So let's say the trial's over. The technician, evidence custodian, takes the knife, puts it back into bin 14, and it sits there again. Uh, uh, until all the paperwork is done, the case is adjudicated. Then the prosecutor will send us some paperwork at the police department and say, okay, this case is, adjudicated. You can either get rid of the evidence, or depending on the level of crime, like it might be something that we're just going to keep forever. Like I said, like with a homicide or something, but typically, with like, uh, just like an assault or something, typically, if the case was adjudicated, then they would say, okay, you can get rid of the evidence, and we would purge it and just, typically like send it somewhere to be destroyed or throw it away, or, dispose of it safely. And that is just one little piece of evidence from one little crime scene. All that I just went through. I mean, think about all the paperwork and the logs and the work just for one little piece of evidence. Think about that, and then think about how mostly cases, especially a murder case, there's dozens, if not hundreds, of pieces of evidence. And I didn't even go to the collection process. Typically, on a scene, uh, modern times, we're going to photograph it and photograph it and photograph it some more. Digital film is cheap. Uh, Depending on the police department, some places will do diagrams where they draw. There's some software now actually where you can take your pictures and put it in, and it actually makes like a 3D diagram, which is pretty cool. And they'll mock it up on a computer. Your evidence, like the knife, you would photograph it from every conceivable angle and way before you touched it, before you even thought about touching it. You put down like little rulers for scale so you could see how big it was before you actually picked it up. And then, like, once you got it back to the PD, you might photograph it some more. I mean, and then when you collect it, you're typically wearing like gloves and probably a mask. Sometimes, I see some guys wear masks, some guys don't. I typically didn't, but you just kind of have to, be mindful, like when you pick something up or with your hands, if you have gloves on, don't like touch your face, don't breathe on your gloves. Uh, Best practice is once you pick up an item and secure it in the evidence in the bag or whatever container you're putting it in, take your gloves off and put new gloves on. So as you can see, the evidence and collection and chain of custody, it's pretty meticulous and time consuming. And any item that was like taken home or kept as an heirloom or trophy by an officer or investigator, likely it wouldn't be allowed in court at all. And the chain of custody would just be, I mean, it would be broken. It would be a mess. So, I mean, where's this shawl been? Who's had access to it? Why is there no record of it being at the crime scene? Are there diagrams? Is there any proof at all that this shawl was at the crime scene other than hearsay and family tradition? My big hang up on this chain of custody is the chain of custody and the lack of documentation. During my time as a police officer, I was constantly told if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. If you forget to add something to your report, then it might as well not have happened. So, on the other side of that, on the flip side, I was always told that if you screw up, it's okay as long as you document it. Um, if you get excited and pick something up without gloves, or maybe you run into an active scene and you run through like a puddle of blood or something and get bloody footprints all over the place. I mean, sure, it's suboptimal for the investigation standpoint, but as long as you document it, it's not the end of the world with the investigation. And a lot of times, sometimes we're just not in control of how evidence is given to us. I've had people show up at the police department with stuff and be like, "Here, this is evidence of this crime." And you're like, "Oh God, why are you holding it?" They're like holding it in their bare hand. Like, you could check it for fingerprints. And I'm like, probably not now. Um, just sometimes it just, you have no control over what happens. You have no control over how the evidence is brought to you. Uh, but typically, at a scene, if you touch something without gloves on, it's okay. Just note it in a report. Let the crime lab know. That way, if they find prints or DNA, they can come to you and get elimination prints or DNA from it, and they can, rule out that evidence as, does it come from you, or is it connected to the suspect, victim, or unknown third party? And, it happens. It's police work. It's not perfect. Like I said, a lot of the times it depends on the world and not, you can be the best trained cop in the world, but if somebody picks the evidence up before you get there or, after the crime, they might not even know it's a crime scene. And I might come in there and grab some stuff and then, oh no, this was important. Here, you can have it back. And it's been contaminated 10 times over. So now we've established how important chain of custody and documentation is. Let's talk a little bit about the DNA study. Um, Mitochondrial DNA expert Peter Gill said the Shaw is, his words, is of dubious origin and has been handled by several people who could have shared the mitochondrial DNA profile. The Shaw or other material could have been contaminated before or while DNA was being tested. Apparently, two of Edo's descendants were known to have been in the same room as the Shaw for 3 days in 2007. And in the words of one critic, the Shaw has been openly handled by loads of people and been touched, breathed upon, and possibly even spat upon. Um, and during my time as a police officer, I submitted several items to the crime lab to be tested for DNA. I even solved a few cases through DNA tests, much like Russell Edwards is claiming here. Uh, However, given my training and experience, I also know that DNA is not the perfect crime solving solution it's often touted to be. It is a great resource, and it can and will solve many great cases. But I've also seen the failure side of DNA testing as well. For example, I found cigarette butts at crime scenes, and I probably don't have to tell you, but as an investigator, a cigarette butt at a crime scene is like striking gold. I mean, it's literally been in somebody's mouth, right? Somebody's been sucking on it. They gave it to, and there's DNA on that spit, right? So you'd think like this is it. This is the mother lode. However, more than once, I have sent a cigarette butt to the crime lab, and it's come back insufficient sample for DNA analysis. And I know this seems impossible for some of you, especially those of you that watch CSI and have been led to believe that human beings are literally just sloughing off DNA every time you move and every step you take, and you're just dropping DNA bombs onto the floor every time you walk across the floor. But that's not reality. I've been disappointed by the crime lab so many times. Items that I know have been in the suspect's hands or mouth has come back basically devoid of any DNA or not enough DNA for the lab to determine identity. Uh, so hopefully telling you all that, now that you know that, you can see why I'm a little bit more than skeptical when it comes to this like bombshell evidence. Uh, this Shaw, it's been unaccounted for 100 years. It was undocumented at the crime scene and is now being touted as the answer to one of the world's biggest mysteries. And honestly, guys, I'm just not ready to accept that. All right. So bear with me for a minute and let's put a pin in Jack the Ripper and talk about a case that I'm a bit more familiar with than the Jack the Ripper case, and that's the DB Cooper case. And unlike Jack the Ripper, I couldn't find any cool names for people that are obsessed with the DB Cooper case other than like Citizen Sleuth, which I think is kind of lame. So I think we need to come up with something. I think, they've got Ripperologists. I think Cooperologist kind of sounds lame too. So I think we should call them Cooper Troopers. I think that's pretty cool. I like it. It's got a good ring to it. I want y'all to start using it in your everyday vernacular. So I guess I would kind of be considered an amateur Cooper Trooper. I don't listen to all the podcasts and I haven't read any of the books on the case. But I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night and I listened to Astonishing Legends. They did a great deep dive on it. And based on that Astonishing Legends series and some of the independent stuff that I did looking into the case, I'm pretty confident I know who DB Cooper was. I'm not going to spoil it. If you want to know, you got to figure it out yourself. But I'm sure you guys saw, like I did here a couple of months ago, my news and YouTube feed was just deluged with articles claiming like DB Cooper mystery solved, DB Cooper identity revealed. And I was like, whoa, cool. So I dove in. I was super disappointed to hear that the suspect that was named was not the suspect that I had in mind. And I admit I was a little disappointed that my guy wasn't the guy, but I was also willing to accept new evidence if there was new evidence. So here's where we run into our parallel with our Jack the Ripper case. Once again, we see a piece of evidence resurfacing like decades later and being touted as the missing link in the case and the answer to the identity of Mystery Man. And the evidence in question in the DB Cooper case was allegedly used by the suspect during the DB Cooper robbery, and it was a parachute. Uh, unlike and like Russell Edward Shaw, the parachute has some problems as well. And my first issue that came with the parachute is like this suspect was on the FBI's radar. They thought they were eyeing him for being DB Cooper, and his home and his shed were searched. But yet, years later, a family member says they find the parachute in the shed, and that it just seems kind of weird to me. I mean, say what you will about the current reputation of the FBI, but I doubt even the feds could screw up so bad to miss a parachute in the shed when investigating a case involving a suspected parachute out of a plane. And secondly, another Cooper trooper has, as the kids say today, brought receipts and provided statements and written maintenance logs describing the parachute that was used by DB Cooper. The descriptions given did not match the ones found. And it's not just by like a little bit either. You know, it's not like some easily overlooked details. The found parachute lacks the D ring that Cooper's parachute had, making it, in my opinion, the wrong parachute and likely the wrong guy. And D rings, I've got my chest pack here, and that's a plastic one there. You can see, you know, you can clip gear and stuff. And the ones on the parachute was used for hooking a auxiliary chute up to. It was a like a former military chute, and the one that was found in the shed that belonged to this alleged suspect had no D rings on it. It was not the right type of parachute, and they had documentation. You know, they when the plane landed, DB Cooper demanded like, "You bring me X amount of parachutes," and the guy, you know, they contacted some skydiving company or something and said, "Hey, we need some parachutes. We've got a hostage situation." And the guy brought like two or three parachutes, whatever Cooper had asked for. And of course, you know, you have to keep maintenance on the, you know, you keep a log on those. You take care of them, you load them, and you know their descriptions, stuff like that. And the one that was found did not match the description that this gentleman gave to the FBI, who gave it to DB Cooper, who used it to jump out of the plane. So Uh, in both these cases, the media has, in my opinion, dropped the ball. Both stories have generated articles and television segments proclaiming like Jack the Ripper identified, DB Cooper mystery solved, DB Cooper identified. And in reality, you know, most people with the information that we have would agree that both mysteries are probably far from conclusively solved. Likely in a few years, some other evidence or theory in one or both of these cases is going to come up, and it's going to hit mainstream media again, and people are going to be like, huh, wasn't that solved like a couple of years ago? Like, I'm pretty sure I saw where that's done with. That's like over with. But, you know, as one of my favorite YouTubers, Brandon Herrera, the AK guy says, is you don't hate journalists enough. Okay. Journalism has gone from reporting information to entertainment. And I kind of look at the news now like I look at gambling. If I have a few extra dollars or minutes, I might like partake in it, but I absolutely do not expect to walk away with anything more than I started with, and I'm likely going to lose some brain cells along the way. Um, you know, just from my time as a, and this doesn't have anything to do with like politics or Trump or fake news or anything like that. This is from my personal experiences. You know, I worked in a small town police department for years, and I was amazed at the amount of times the local news got a story wrong, got a name wrong, got just facts just completely misrepresented in the news. And it wasn't that hard, guys. Like the newspaper could go to the courthouse and get the charging documents that we, the police department, filed with the courthouse. And basically, they would have the same information that the court had. and they would still get it wrong. Like all they'd have to do literally is just copy and paste our report into the news article, and they would still make like blaring, horrible, terrible mistakes. So, I don't know what to tell you. I don't trust everything I read anymore. That being said, I do see a few articles that seem to be taking more of a skeptical approach to the Jack the Ripper thing. So, I mean, I guess good on them for that. Don't get me wrong. I don't think they shouldn't be reporting these stories, but the way the stories are portrayed are pretty misleading to say the least. I mean, I think a better headline for both of these types of stories would be new theory emerges in the search for this criminal, not, the criminal is identified or, DB Cooper identified. But anyway, guys, all that being said, I think it's about time we wrap this up. But before we go, I want to point out a few more things about Jack the Ripper and our suspect, Aaron Kosminski, in the case in general. So let's get into that. All right. So getting into my final thoughts and conclusions on this, the first thing that I want to touch on is that Kosminski was reported to be very docile in the asylum. And apart from like the accusation that he threatened someone with a knife that got him committed in the first place, there was one other incident where he had threatened an orderly or an employee at the asylum with a chair. But other than that, he was a model patient. And not only that, but Kosminski apparently he didn't speak English great. Like his preferred language to speak was Yiddish, and his English wasn't so good. So, could a person who barely spoke English and was schizophrenic lure 5 prostitutes down dark alleys, especially after some of the other murders had occurred? Surely some of them were, a little bit more alert or on watch. And, there's also more than one account of the victims being seen conversing with someone who spoke English before their bodies were found. So, I mean, that doesn't look good for Kosminski being Jack the Ripper. For every compelling factor that points towards him being the Ripper, it seems, in my opinion anyway, that there are multiple reasons why he wouldn't be. As a police officer, the chain of custody is in the dubious history of the Shaw just makes my skin crawl. It might be enough to sway the media and the court of public opinion or people who only read headlines. But in my opinion, it's not enough to prove it in a court of law. We'll see what happens. Apparently, there is a push to get some kind of legal proceeding started. If the Shaw was really indeed found on or near the crime scene, which seems unlikely to me. I mean, it was an outdoor scene. It's on the street. It's not like a closed off room or building. It could have been dropped or lost before the murder occurred, maybe even after the murder occurred, without some kind of collaborative evidence, like a photo of the victim with the matching shawl, or a statement from a friend of the victim or a relative of the victim describing the shawl and saying, like, oh, yeah, that's her shawl. I don't think we should take it at face value. And, like I said, like the kids say, they need to bring receipts. By the way, the Journal of Forensic Science looked at Edward's DNA study and published an expression of concern, which I'm not familiar with. I had to look up what it was. Apparently, an expression of concern is when someone is the way the scientific circles say that let people know that there may be a problem or concern with the validity of a published research article. So basically, the science nerds are telling us that the science isn't sciencing. That's what a letter of concern is. And as to the actual identity of Jack the Ripper, I don't know. There are probably more potential suspects for Jack the Ripper than there are DB Cooper. Uh, speaking as a cop from kind of a profiling angle, in my opinion, the Whitechapel murders, they feel like somebody that's angry at prostitutes. One of the suspects is alleged to have had a case of syphilis, and that could lead to a motive to take revenge. Further, all the victims, at least the canonical ones, were found either out in the open or uncovered. A lot of times, when a suspect or murderer will cover the victim, like they'll find a body and it's covered up or it's got something placed over it. That means, if it's obscured, it means the victim, I'm sorry, the suspect or the murderer feels guilty about what they've done. They feel ashamed. And that doesn't seem to be the case with the Ripper murders. I mean, the bodies were out there for the world to see. He wasn't ashamed of what he'd done. And, from a profiling perspective, I'd be confident in saying that they were personal, committed out of like anger or revenge. And, further, the fact that he was never like caught in act seems to suggest to me, at least, that it was somebody operating with the knowledge that what they were doing was wrong. So they kind of had all their faculties about them. Somebody that was experiencing like a manic episode, suffering from schizophrenia, would, in my opinion, probably be likely to get caught in the act. People with mental illness back in the 1800s, they didn't know they were mentally ill. I've said it a lot of times. Crazy people don't know they're crazy. And during my time as a police officer, dealing with a lot of mentally ill people, they're likely to just start chatting away with you about the robot lizard man that told them they needed to sell all their possessions and move out in the middle of the desert, with no hint that what they're telling you is not exactly something that a sane, normal person, would hesitate to tell someone. To them, that's their reality, and they expect everyone to be in that reality, just like you expect everyone to be in the reality that you experience. So, in conclusion, I think that Jack the Ripper was operating on a little bit more than schizophrenia and luck. I don't know who he was, but in my opinion, there's at least a couple other suspects that are better suited for the crimes than Aaron Kosminski. And yeah, that's all I have to say about that. So listen, guys, thank you so much for listening or watching, however you enjoyed this content. I hope you enjoyed it. I want to take a second to tell you something that I've been thinking about for a while now. And that is that I am likely starting a new podcast probably later this year, probably toward the winter. I'm not going to stop doing a last watch, but I am probably going to start a new podcast as well. And I'm leaning toward like a true crime type podcast, kind of like this one was, like the one you just listened to. I take my training experience as a police officer. I look at cases, I give some case studies, and give my opinions and observations from an investigator's point of view. Uh, my other idea was maybe to do like a pop culture podcast where I talk about movies and comics and books and stuff. But I think probably the true crime is the way to go. I think people are really enjoying that now. So if you like this, let me know. Give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment. Share it with somebody who will enjoy it, and urge them to reach out and let me know that they liked it. The more interactions I get, the more motivated I'll be to start something new. Your feedback will be appreciated. So thank you guys so much for watching or listening, and until next time, the beans abides.